The control center of the USS Vengeance was never truly quiet, even when no one spoke. The low, mechanical hum pressed against the walls, a constant reminder of the engines and life support systems working unseen. The air was heavy with the smell of recycled oxygen, tinged faintly with oil and disinfectant. Dim light pooled over the consoles, leaving the rest of the room in soft shadow. Major Amanda Reyes sat at her station, headset snug over her ears, hands steady above the keyboard as she cycled through a routine diagnostic. The space was cramped enough that her elbow brushed the side panel each time she shifted, but she had long ago learned to move with the economy of someone who could work blindfolded. The order came in without warning. A red indicator pulsed on the incoming message panel, the kind of light that was designed to make the heart rate jump. The sealed packet, its encryption header gleaming on her display, carried a priority code she had only seen twice in her career. She glanced toward the executive officer, who gave a sharp nod. No words were needed. Protocol dictated that she confirm receipt immediately. Her fingers entered the access sequence in exact order, the numbers and letters rolling through muscle memory. The system unlocked, and the target data populated across her screen. Coordinates. She read them once. Then again, the numbers settling into her mind in a way that felt wrong before she could articulate why. The authentication watermark showed green. The order was legitimate by every measurable check. She began the standard verification, cross-referencing the grid with the onboard navigation charts. The results made her pause. The location was not an uninhabited zone. It was a sprawling urban district in an allied nation, a place she knew held schools, hospitals, dense housing. She zoomed in, confirming the layers of civilian infrastructure. Her training urged her to keep moving through the checklist. Her conscience rooted her in place. The mechanical hum of the submarine seemed louder now, wrapping around her like the depth of the ocean itself. Somewhere behind her, a chair creaked, and the XO shifted his weight. His voice was calm, but clipped, telling her to proceed. She gave no answer. Instead, she rechecked the coordinates through an independent mapping module, watching the screen render the street grid with its lines like veins across the city. The primary point of impact sat less than 2 blocks from a marked school. Amanda's breathing slowed. She felt the pressure of the crew's presence, even if none of them were looking directly at her. The launch protocol required her to move to the next step final armament sequence, verification with the secondary officer, and countdown initiation. Her hand hovered above the key for a heartbeat too long. She toggled to the communication log, running a silent trace of the packet's origin. The data chain showed a clean route through Fleet Command. No breaks, no anomalies yet. Something in the time signature sat oddly in her mind. She stored the thought away, knowing there was no room for delay that could be traced back to hesitation. The XO leaned closer, his shadow cutting across her console. His voice dropped in volume, but not in weight. He told her again to continue. Instead, Amanda opened the secondary confirmation panel and held it there. Her face remained unreadable. The fading alarm tone that signaled pending action pulsed in the background, its pitch softening each time it looped, as though losing its own conviction. She glanced once more at the map, the coordinates still locked in the center of the display. Numbers that, on their own, meant nothing. Numbers that, to her, now carried the weight of hundreds of lives. She pressed the acknowledgement key. The system registered her compliance. The XO stepped back, satisfied. The crew's attention shifted, the moment passing in the room even as it remained fixed in her mind. She did not, however, begin the sequence. Instead, she kept her posture neutral, eyes on the screen, while inside, her decision had already been made. The submarine continued on its silent path under the Atlantic, insulated from the world it could alter in an instant. Amanda felt that isolation keenly now, as though the steel hull around them was as much a moral boundary as a physical one. The conspiracy had made its first, appearance, in the form of a string of distorted coordinates, dressed in the authority of proper encryption. She recognized it for what it was, even if no one else here did. When the XO moved on to check another station, Amanda's hand rested lightly over the console. She would not launch. She would acknowledge, but not act. That choice, quiet and invisible for now, would change everything that followed. The alarm tone faded one last time into the hum of the engines, leaving her alone with the weight of what she had just decided. The pressure in the control center was not loud. It was felt in the way conversations thinned, in the narrowing of glances toward her station, in the stillness of the XO as he stood just inside her peripheral vision. Amanda Reyes kept her breathing steady, fingers poised above the keys. The launch order had been authenticated, verified by every official system. The next step, by the book, was to arm the missile and begin the countdown. The XO's voice came again, low and clipped, telling her to proceed. Around her, the crew pretended to work, but their eyes flicked to her console every few seconds. She moved without hurry, keying in the sequence to access the targeting module. Each step was deliberate, her posture unchanged, the tone of a professional carrying out a routine. The system prompted her to confirm the existing coordinates. She bypassed the prompt and opened a secondary targeting panel that allowed manual entry under certain operational conditions. A quiet chime acknowledged the override access. The XO shifted his stance, his arms crossing. No one spoke. Amanda entered a set of coordinates she had memorized years ago during training simulations, an uninhabited stretch of ocean far from shipping lanes. Her hands were steady on the controls, typing in the numbers without hesitation. She initiated the verification loop, watching as the system cross-checked the new target against all operational parameters. The screen flashed green, accepting the change. The confirmation light began to blink steadily, signaling readiness. The XO leaned closer, scanning her screen. His brow furrowed slightly, but he said nothing. The crew at the other consoles had gone quiet, the air thick with unasked questions. Amanda locked the coordinates, secured the entry, and closed the manual override. She followed the exact keystrokes necessary to complete the sequence without triggering an audit alert. Every movement was measured, nothing wasted. When the final confirmation appeared, she pressed the key that would initiate the arming process. The system recognized the target as valid, but by design, the missile would detonate harmlessly upon reaching that empty quadrant of ocean. She knew this would not go unnoticed for long, but in the moment, the action passed like any other operational step. The launch window ticked down, then froze. The central display updated with the word "scrubbed." A murmur passed through the room, quickly silenced. The XO's expression flattened. He spoke into his headset, a brief exchange with command, then turned to her. "Step away from the console, Major." His tone was calm, but it carried no room for discussion. Amanda stood, removing her headset with unhurried precision, and set it on the edge of the console. The confined space seemed smaller now, the hum of the submarine deeper in her ears. She did not look at anyone as she stepped aside. The XO reached forward, unfastened the small metal nameplate from the lip of her station, and set it down without ceremony. The sound of it touching the console was almost inaudible, but she heard it clearly. There was no accusation voiced, no raised voice, no overt sign of what had just happened. The atmosphere was cold, professional, and final. A replacement slid into her seat, hands already moving over the controls, the new nameplate not yet fixed in place. Amanda stood at the edge of the room, hands behind her back, gaze level. The XO returned to his post, issuing a series of routine commands that signaled the crew to resume standard operations. No one thanked her. No one confronted her. The absence of recognition was deliberate, a quiet acknowledgement that she was already being moved out of the chain. In the tight, pressurized world of the submarine, such an absence spoke louder than any reprimand. She understood what it meant. She had averted a disaster that would never be publicly named, and in doing so, she had marked herself as someone to be erased. The confirmation light on her former console still blinked for the uninhabited ocean coordinates, a quiet testament to the choice she had made. It would blink for another few seconds before shutting down entirely, leaving no trace except in the memories of those who had witnessed it. Amanda turned away, the narrow passageway outside the control center seeming even more confining. The hull around her was a steel boundary, but it was not the real prison. That was the knowledge she carried now, and the certainty that her role here was already over. The naval detention quarters were bare and without comfort, a metal-framed cot bolted to the floor and a single light overhead that hummed with a faint, uneven buzz. Amanda Reyes spent less than a day there, long enough to understand that this was not about holding her for questioning, but about keeping her in a place where every movement could be observed. The walls were painted a dull off-white that seemed to swallow sound. Even the air felt monitored. When the door finally opened, it was not for release into freedom, but a transfer. The coastal debrief facility was quieter, cleaner, and on the surface far less restrictive. Wide windows looked out over an empty stretch of shoreline. There were no bars, no locked cell doors. She could walk to the cafeteria without an escort. The illusion of openness was deliberate. Every window reflected her back at herself, and she knew the cameras were hidden where she could not see them. Outside the gate, a dark SUV was parked at the same angle every time she glanced that way, its occupants rarely emerging. She moved carefully in this new environment, choosing her words with precision when speaking to anyone in uniform and keeping her tone level even when questioned. On the few occasions she was allowed into town, she noted the shadowed vehicles trailing just far enough behind to blend with traffic. At a cafe, she caught the brief glint of mirrored sunglasses from across the street, the kind that showed nothing but returned her own image. It was during one of these sanctioned errands that she saw him, a junior technician she had trained years earlier, back when she still believed the system rewarded competence. He did not greet her. They passed in opposite directions on a narrow sidewalk, and in that moment, without breaking stride or making eye contact, his hand brushed hers. She felt the thin rectangle of paper slide into her grip. She kept walking. Only when she was back in her assigned room did she unfold it. The fragment was printed on heavy stock, the edges slightly frayed as though torn from a larger report. At the top was a timestamp from the launch order, but below it was an encryption signature she'd never seen before. It was similar to fleet authentication, but the key structure was wrong off by a pattern that would never have passed through the normal chain without triggering a verification challenge. Amanda stared at the fragment, tracing the odd arrangement of numbers and letters with her finger. She felt the weight of it, heavier than its physical mass, because it was the first concrete proof that the order had not come through legitimate channels. Someone had forced it in through a parallel path designed to mimic the real one. She burned the image into her memory before sliding the paper between the pages of a training manual she kept by her bedside. She would not carry it in the open, nor would she risk showing it to anyone else. The technician had risked his career, and possibly more, to get it to her. And if she made a single misstep, that risk would have been for nothing. The detention cell had been a cage, but at least its bars were visible. This place, with its salt air and clean windows, was just another kind of confinement. The submarine had been steel and pressure. This was glass and silence. Both could crush her if she let them. She knew now that she would have to move as she had taught others to move without drawing notice, without leaving trails, because the only way to survive and uncover the truth was to remain the ghost they could not catch. Amanda worked where she could not be traced easily, never using the same location twice in a row. Public libraries were her first choice anonymous terminals, minimal questions, the steady background noise of people who had no idea what she was doing. She would take a seat near a wall, never with her back to the entrance, and log in under a generic guest account. Her tools were basic, the same ones any civilian could access, But in her hands, they became a means to cross-reference layers of information most would never think to connect. The coordinates sat in her notebook, written over and over until they formed a dense block of numbers. The notebook was worn, the cover softened from years of use, the spine beginning to split. Some pages held clean rows, others were marked with circles, arrows, and small notations only she could interpret. At first glance, they were meaningless. With each session, they began to shift in her mind, not as static points but as a pattern with direction and intent. Amanda built the picture slowly. Public land surveys led her to historical maps. Declassified reports offered faint traces of what had once been restricted. The coordinates overlapped in a way that suggested boundaries, not random points. On the third day, using an archived set of satellite images, she saw it clearly, a grid that matched the footprint of an old military testing range. Most of it had been redeveloped into civilian neighborhoods, schools, housing complexes, and a community medical center now occupied the ground where classified trials had once been carried out. The deeper she went, the more the past pushed into the present. Newspaper articles from decades earlier mentioned a containment breach at a nearby facility, details vague and dates inconsistent. Cross-referencing survivor relocation records with the redevelopment map tightened the picture. Many of the civilians living in that area now had ties to those relocation efforts. It was no longer just a cluster of numbers. It was a target painted on people who had lived through something the government had buried. She kept her expression neutral, even as the implications settled over her. A biological weapons accident. Survivors moved into a new district. Years later, those same streets appearing as the center point of a missile launch order. It was deliberate. There was no other way the coordinates could have aligned so perfectly. Amanda began compiling the information into a secure file on the library terminal, attaching her own notes to the public sources. She never let her focus waver, her eyes scanning the screen while her left hand absent-mindedly flipped the corner of her notebook. She was halfway through cross-referencing medical center records when the terminal screen flickered. The cursor froze in place. A faint delay lagged each keystroke. She moved to save the file, but the system hesitated, then blinked out entirely. The login screen returned. The guest account reset to its original state. Every file she had been building was gone. She sat still for a few seconds, the hum of the library suddenly louder in her ears. Someone had reached into the terminal remotely and shut her down. Amanda closed her notebook, slid it into her bag, and stood. She didn't look around the room. She didn't need to. Her location was now tagged, and whoever had pulled her session would know she had been digging in places they preferred stayed buried. She walked to the exit at a measured pace, stepping into the gray afternoon light without a change in expression. The submarine had been a sealed world where pressure was physical and constant. Here, in open public spaces, the pressure was different, but no less real. Privacy was an illusion, and she was already moving in a world where every action was recorded somewhere. The coordinates were no longer a puzzle. They were a warning. And now she knew enough to be considered a threat. The Navy Medical Research Site sat far from any main road, hidden behind a stretch of woods that had reclaimed most of the old access path. Amanda stopped short of the gate, surveying the perimeter. The chain-link fencing was overgrown, vines wrapping around the rusted links, and a weathered sign still clung to one post, its faded letters warning of restricted entry. The building beyond looked tired and abandoned, its white paint peeled to gray, windows clouded with grime. She moved to the access panel beside the gate and slid her old identification card from her pocket. It was worn smooth along the edges from years of use, but the embedded strip still carried its original coding. She swiped it once, waited, then swiped again. The small light on the panel stayed red for a moment too long, then flicked to green. There was a muted click as the lock disengaged. She slipped inside, letting the gate close silently behind her. The interior air was cool and dry, with the stale scent of dust, the sharp bite of old disinfectant, and an undercurrent of faint ozone that reminded her of sterilization equipment. Fluorescent fixtures overhead hummed faintly, though most were dead. leaving long corridors in half-light. She moved with care, boots quiet on the cracked tile, checking each doorway for signs of recent use. In a small records room, she found rows of shelving lined with logbooks. The covers were brittle to the touch, their spines creaking when she opened them. Inside, the pages had been stripped of identifying details, no names, no patient IDs, just a series of clinical notes. The handwriting was precise, each entry documenting symptoms in short, detached phrases, acute respiratory failure, hemorrhagic lesions, neurological degradation. They matched patterns she had seen in classified training on weaponized pathogens. Entire sections were left blank, as if entire days of data had been deliberately removed. She took out her small notebook and began copying the entries word for word, her hand steady despite the weight settling in her chest. Each phrase was confirmation without full proof, a piece of a puzzle she already knew the shape of. The room was still except for the faint scratch of her pen, until she heard it. At first it was barely audible, a low, rhythmic vibration somewhere deeper in the building. She followed the sound through 2 more hallways and into a maintenance alcove. In the corner sat an ancient generator, dust thick on its casing, but still running. The hum was slightly uneven, dipping every few seconds in a way that struck her instantly. It was the same pitch pattern she had heard in the missile control center when the alarm tone had begun to fade. That same rise and fall, out of sync with perfect precision, as if carrying a hesitation. Amanda stood still, listening, letting the sound fix itself in her mind. This was no random connection. It was a direct sensory bridge between that day in the submarine and what had happened here years before. She took 1 step closer, enough to read the maintenance log taped to the side. The entries stopped abruptly more than a decade ago. She recorded the generator's serial number, the room number, and the exact tone pattern in her notes before slipping back toward the entrance. Every detail mattered. Outside, the air felt fresher, but heavier. She had seen enough to know the coordinates were not just arbitrary targets. They were tethered to a history of biological weapons research that had left survivors witnesses, and now a reason for someone to erase an entire district. Her stand on the submarine had been instinct and principle. Now it was confirmed by the dust on her hands and the hum still echoing in her ears. Amanda left the research site under a flat gray sky, the air heavy with the smell of damp earth. She kept her pace even until she reached her car, then checked the mirrors twice before pulling away. At the first intersection, a glint in a storefront window caught her attention. The reflection of a black SUV idling half a block behind. She turned right, the vehicle following at the same measured distance. The pattern was deliberate, the kind used by trained surveillance teams to stay present without crowding their target. Her hands stayed steady on the wheel as she adjusted her route. She left the main road for a narrower 2-lane track, letting overhanging trees break up the sight lines. Gravel popped under her tires when she eased onto the shoulder, slowing just enough to make a turn at the last possible moment. The SUV did not appear in her mirrors immediately. When it did, it was closer, the driver committing to the chase. Amanda shifted into the practiced rhythm of counter-surveillance driving she had been taught years ago. She timed her acceleration for blind curves, using each rise and drop of the road to mask her position. She passed through a short stretch where the branches overhead knitted into a canopy, shadowing the road so completely she could kill her lights without being seen. The SUV dropped back again, likely waiting for a clearer shot. That was her opening. She veered onto an unmarked dirt road, tires throwing up a low cloud of dust, and took the next turn without slowing. 15 minutes later, the SUV was gone. She doubled back twice, ensuring no secondary tail had been planted, before making for the safe house. The small rented building was just as she had left it, but the lock on the back door showed the faintest scuff near the latch. Someone had been inside. She did not need to check the rooms to know the space was no longer secure. Amanda set a metal tray on the kitchen counter and pulled her notebook from her bag. She paged through it one last time, selecting the most sensitive entries' coordinates cross-referenced with survivor lists, patterns of movement she had only half confirmed. She tore them out in clean strips, stacking them neatly before touching a match to the pile. The paper curled black at the edges, flames eating through numbers and notes that had taken weeks to compile. When only ash remained, she tipped the tray toward the open window, letting the fragments scatter into the night air. The loss was sharp, but necessary. Carrying them now would be an invitation for someone else to take them. She stood in the doorway a final moment, looking over the room. The safe house had been a place to think, to piece things together. Now it was compromised. Just another address on a list she would never see. Amanda stepped out without looking back, her mind already turning to the next move, aware that, from here on, there was no margin for error. The retired signals officer lived in a narrow brick house on the edge of a quiet street, its curtains drawn against the afternoon sun. Amanda parked 2 blocks away and walked the rest, her pace steady, eyes on the pavement. He was waiting at the door before she knocked, his expression unreadable. Without a word, he stepped aside and led her down a set of creaking stairs into a basement that smelled faintly of dust and machine oil. The space was more archive than living area. Shelves lined every wall, stacked with labeled boxes whose handwriting had faded but was still precise. Old radios and signal boards sat on heavy workbenches, their switches and dials polished by years of use. In the corner, a single desk lamp cast a pool of warm light over a stack of papers. He moved to the desk and pulled out a folder, setting it down with a deliberate care that made the gesture feel ceremonial. "This is what you saw," he said, his voice low and even. He slid a sheet toward her. The code printed on it was identical to the encryption signature in the launch order she had intercepted, but he pointed to a subtle variation. "It's a ghost key, dormant override, not for warfighting, not for deterrence, strictly for cleanup, outside normal rules of engagement." Amanda kept her posture still, her hands folded loosely in front of her. Inside, each word was filing into place with what she had already uncovered. He went on, explaining that the target city had been the site of a covert program decades earlier, the same one whose remnants she had traced through survivor relocation records. The order to strike had not been a rogue act, it had come from inside U.S. channels, authorized to erase evidence that was never meant to resurface. He opened another box, revealing yellowed paper sheets covered in dense, handwritten code tables. The ink had bled slightly into the fibers over time, but the markings were still legible. Each one represented the skeleton of operations no longer acknowledged. Their key is still able to awaken systems long thought dormant. "These don't go away," he said, pausing long enough for the weight of the statement to settle between them. Amanda stepped closer to the desk, scanning the documents without touching them until he gave a short nod. She began selecting specific pages, sliding them into the flatbed scanner on the table beside the desk. The machine hummed softly as it worked, the light bar passing under each page. She moved with precision, choosing only what could not be explained away if found on her, the rest committed to memory. The officer watched in silence, his gaze guarded but steady. When the last page was scanned, she returned the originals exactly as she had found them. The officer closed the folder and replaced it in the box. He did not offer her encouragement, only a measured look that carried both warning and a trace of respect. Amanda placed the copies in her bag, securing them between 2 layers of clothing. She knew what leaving with them meant. If she had been a problem before, she was now a loose end. As she climbed the stairs, the hum of the old radio in the corner followed her, its steady tone reminding her of the fading alarm back on the submarine. Some signals lingered long after the transmission ended. Outside, the street was quiet. She walked back to her car without looking over her shoulder, the weight of the files pressing against her side and the certainty growing that the circle around her was already tightening. The room was bare enough to hear every shift in the chair beneath her. A narrow desk stood against the wall, its surface clean except for 2 objects she had carried through every stage of this hunt: Amanda set them down side by side, the original launch keycard and the printed fragment of the order. The keycard was smooth, its edges worn from years of handling, still holding the weight of its intended purpose. The paper was different, fibrous, slightly curled at the corners, with ink that seemed heavier than its thin sheet should bear. Together, they told the whole story, one of duty twisted into betrayal. She leaned back, letting her fingertips rest on the card's surface, tracing its embossed lettering without looking directly at it. The paper fragment lay within her peripheral vision, an unwelcome reminder that the path she had followed was no longer about speculation. The proof was there. She could take it public names, codes, dates, and in doing so invite the full weight of the system onto herself. Or she could use it to work deeper inside, dismantling piece by piece what had been built to survive exactly this kind of exposure. Her gaze shifted between the two objects, the air in the room steady and unmoving. No spoken argument played out, only the slow rhythm of her breathing and the small tightening of her jaw as each consequence unfolded in her mind. Public meant speed. The sudden flare of truth before it was buried again, with her buried alongside it. Infiltration meant time, patience, and a constant risk of being erased before she could reach the core. Amanda reached for the phone. The plastic was cool in her hand, the line humming faintly after the first ring. When the voice answered, she spoke without preamble. "I need you to find the other coordinates." There was no question in her tone, no explanation offered. A pause followed. Short, but telling, before the voice on the other end agreed in a low, measured reply. She ended the call without farewell. The room returned to silence. She set the phone down, the small click sounding sharper than it should have. Her eyes went back to the keycard and the paper fragment. Neither moved, but both seemed to carry more weight now, as if they knew they had been chosen for something final. She placed the keycard over the paper, aligning the edges until they formed a single, uneven rectangle. Outside, the world kept its own pace cars passing somewhere beyond the walls, wind pressing faintly against the glass. Inside, the air felt as though it was holding its breath, waiting for her next move. Amanda stayed seated, her hands resting flat on the desk, her decision sealed behind the stillness of her expression. What she would do next remained unspoken, but the path had already shifted beneath her feet.